as we get ready to start. That was a great, perfectly timed reminder. Check your phones and turn them off. It'll be wonderful. Before we start, welcome everybody. I like right now to take people's temperature around masks. I ask that we all keep our masks on, but at the same time, we'll do a thumbs up or thumbs down. If you feel comfortable with our speaker taking his mask off, you can put your thumbs up, and if you don't feel comfortable, put your thumbs down. Okay. We were both agreed. If only one person put their thumbs down, we would, he would keep it on. And but this is so nice, right? You can see I'm smiling to see you. So thank you for coming here. Welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. I am Beth Hessel, the Executive Director, and I welcome all of you tonight warmly on behalf of the staff and the board. And our board president, Ned Scharf, is here. You want to wave so people can see who you are in the nice, crisp white and blue linen shirt. So if you have any questions about the Athenaeum afterward, you can go to him and ask him questions. We are so glad that you are here in spite of the rain. And come on in, have a seat. Whether you're a longtime member or you were drawn here tonight for the first time out of curiosity and interest in the topic, we're glad that you're here. If you're a member of the Athenaeum or you've been hearing about us, you know that we are a community that celebrates curiosity and encourages wonder. We are a community that loves to read together, to think together, to learn together, and have great conversations about literature and art, about history and our built environment, and the intersections of all of these in our neighborhoods and our world today. It's an honor for me as your executive director to get to find fantastic speakers who can come and elucidate these questions and these issues for us. If you're not a member, know that we always welcome members. It's not a closed door. So if you're interested in knowing more, don't hesitate to ask me or one of our other staff who you see here tonight, or Ned, about how you become a member. And we're happy to help you become a part of this community and share with you many of our benefits. Now, our guest speaker tonight, I think one of the things that you'll note about him if you start looking online is that he has a signature hat that he wears. Joseph Joe Margulies is a professor of practice, law, and government at Cornell University, but as he'll quickly tell you, that is not all the full scope of who he is. As a civil rights attorney, Joe focuses on criminal law and human rights, having, among other things, represented detainees at Guantanamo Bay, including Abu Zubaydah. If you remember, that was led to Bush's memo about waterboarding and such kind of treatment of detainees. Margulies considers himself an avid student of life. We had a wonderful conversation when he came in. It's just a delight to get to know him. He continues to explore the inequities of the American criminal justice system, but also considers himself a, quote, student of neighborhood well-being. His forthcoming book, Thanks for Everything, Now Get Out, Can We Restore Neighborhoods Without Destroying Them? And I think that will be, I think one of our displays in the library of circulating books are books with the most interesting titles. And I think that one might be one that would qualify there. It is asked questions that we in Philadelphia are asking as we look at how do we create vibrant and equitable neighborhoods that allow for the flourishing of all Philadelphians and not just the few. And this makes me think, too, today is Bruce Springsteen's birthday. So think about that film, Philadelphia, and its depiction of our city and the many inequities that we face in it. So while his book will be released in a few weeks, we are grateful to Richard and Weingart and Pedhouse Books, who are back here to do pre-sales of the book. And I think did you bring brought some little book plates, which Joe can sign if you buy a book. And we'll also put it out again and remind you all when the book comes out, but take your chance now so you can get a signed copy. Now, we all look forward to the day when we can again safely and joyfully gather after programs around a plentiful reception table. Yet the limitations of this COVID pandemic have reminded us all that it's not the food and the drink, but the warm spirits and the open minds of those with whom we gather that create meaning and purpose. So I invite you to remain after the talk for conversation with one another, even if we cannot have a glass of wine in our hands while we do so, and to talk with Joseph Margulies as well. And at this moment, I want to invite you to join me in a warm welcome for our guest speaker this evening.
Hi, everyone. That was really sweet. Thank you very much. So I just want to one more check. We're good with me because at Cornell I teach with my mask on, so I'm used to it. If you're good with my mask off, I'll take it off. But anybody, okay then? Very good. And you can change your vote at any point. So if anybody says, I'm really happy to be here. I was telling Beth before we got started, Philadelphia is one of my favorite towns, and I don't say that simply because I'm here. If I were in St. Louis, I wouldn't say. In fact, if I were in St. Louis, I'd say Philadelphia is one of my favorite towns. But Philadelphia encapsulates a lot of what is so important to me. Philadelphia is a real town, and I'm always comfortable here. I'm always at home here. I want you to imagine a neighborhood. I just want you to imagine a neighborhood in a city, an urban neighborhood. And it's in a major city, and let's imagine it's in a city like Philadelphia. It doesn't have to be, but let's just say it's in a city like Philadelphia. And this is a working class neighborhood. And in fact, some people would call it a poor neighborhood. That's how other people would describe it. It's certainly a low-income neighborhood. And relative to wealthier parts of this city, it's certainly true that the people who live there are considerably less well off. And many of them live much closer to the poverty line. And in fact, in our imaginary neighborhood, in our imaginary city, a great many of the people who live there, the residents there, are below the poverty line. And in our imaginary neighborhood, there is a great deal more unemployment than there might be in the rest of our city. And many people who work there, they are seasonally unemployed, and so their work is cyclical, their work is episodic, and they are frequently laid off. And unlike in wealthier parts of the city, their jobs do not carry with them the benefits that some of us have come to expect. They do not enjoy sick leave or child care or paid vacations or health insurance. So this is a what people call a poor neighborhood in a major U.S. city. But just like in the wealthy part of town, the great majority of residents in our imaginary neighborhood, just like in every neighborhood, in every city, get up every morning and bundle their kids off to school and then fight with a commute to get to work and put in an honest day's work and then come home to be with their families. The great majority of folks go through the same thing every morning that most of us do. So this is our imaginary low-income neighborhood. But when you think about this, when you close your eyes and your mind's eye brings to mind this imaginary neighborhood, I want to ask you to be honest and ask whether there are other things that you see. Do you see more than just the residents who get up every morning and get their kids off to school and put in a day's work? Do you see vacant lots? Do you see abandoned homes? Do you see boarded storefronts, buckled streets, and darkened alleys? Do you smell trash? Do you hear the sound of sirens? Do you hear gunshots at night? In other words, do you, like many people, like most of us, automatically associate, even without conscious thought, poverty with distress? Do you automatically, without conscious thought, associate in an urban low-income neighborhood, which in the United States, if it's an urban low-income neighborhood, that overwhelmingly means it's likely to be black or brown, black or Latinx. Do you associate poverty with distress? When you think about the school, do you think, well, this is a failing urban school, overcrowded, underserved, maybe dangerous? Do you think the police are a regular presence in this neighborhood, with regular reports of brutality and chronic levels of mistrust between the residents and the police who are sworn to serve them? Is that the image that comes to mind if we're honest with each other? So now, let me ask this. Now imagine that the neighborhood is starting to change. Now imagine that this neighborhood is transforming. Now imagine that the sprawling, toxic waste dump that was on the southern border of the neighborhood is converted into a glistening, verdant urban park, one of the premier parks in the city. And imagine that vacant lots and abandoned houses throughout the neighborhood are converted into hundreds of new homes and apartments. And you start to see change in the neighborhood, and the streets are repaired, and the alleys are lit, and the school is reclaimed and becomes a neighborhood anchor. And the police department is completely reorganized and becomes a model for a very different way of policing. And so now, as you see this change taking place in this imaginary neighborhood in an imaginary city, let me ask you something else, if we're being honest with each other. Do you start to imagine now that the neighborhood is becoming whiter and wealthier and more credentialed, better credentialed? Does the transformation imply a change in the demographics of the neighborhood? Query which leads which, but somehow when you think about the neighborhood that is changing, it also becomes whiter and more expensive. So, of course, this is not an imaginary neighborhood. This neighborhood is in every city in the country, every major city in the country. In fact, there are many of them in the city of Philadelphia. And my book tells the story of one of these neighborhoods. My book is about a neighborhood called Olneyville. Is there anybody here from Providence? No? Great town, another great town. Like Philadelphia, smaller, but like Philadelphia, a working town. And Olneyville is a small Latinx, predominantly Latinx neighborhood on the west side of Providence. Providence made its home, made its money in the textile industry. And in the mid-19th century and early 20th century, Providence was the center of the New England textile industry, particularly for woolens. Providence was a woolens town, not a cotton town. And Olneyville was the beating heart of the Providence textile industry. And the factories, the textile plants, and the various plants that supported the textile industry lined the major arteries that ran through Olneyville and surrounded the urban, the inner core, the residential core. And the residents of Olneyville, which has always been an immigrant neighborhood, Italian and Irish and Polish and Russian Jew, lived in this urban core, and they marked their days by the bell of the factory, the textile factories that signaled when their shift began and when their shift ended. Olneyville was a thriving neighborhood. In fact, it was originally its own city. Providence annexed it in 1903, but through the 18th century, it was a thriving industrial town. The commercial center of Olneyville is called Olneyville Square, which is a tangled jumble of streets that collide together. And in Olneyville's heyday, it was the second busiest commercial district in the city after the downtown, which in Providence they call Down City. So much so that they used to call Olneyville Square the second downtown. But you all know this history. Those days are long since gone. Those days are long since gone. The textile industry collapsed before other major industries in the United States. But by the 50s and 60s, Olneyville was suffering badly. By the 70s, it had completely collapsed, lost half of its population. In the 80s and 90s, the demographics changed, and Olneyville became Latinx, with a wave of Latino newcomers who came into the country then. But a new demographic profile couldn't change a battered economy. And by the 80s and 90s, by the end of the 20th century, Olneyville was that place that I described. It was one of the most depressed, distressed, violent, blighted neighborhoods in all of Providence. In fact, in the whole state of Rhode Island. It was legendary up and down New England. People knew about Olneyville. Well, of course, today Olneyville is very different. My book talks about this transformation. It traces the transformation that has taken place and describes the work by activists and organizers and organizations and residents that led to this change, that wrenched funding from the state, local, and federal level to clean up this park, which had been, clean up this toxic dump, which had been a magnet for crime and drugs and the sex trade and gang activity, and marked the entrance to the neighborhood. The entrance to the neighborhood was this sagging toxic dump that was created after a textile factory burned down in '89. And just imagine this in a wealthy part of town. The factory burned down December 23rd of 1989, and Providence, perennially cash-strapped, just let the charred carcass lay on the ground. And it sat there for over a decade, right? So this is what happens in a neighborhood like Olneyville. Would that ever happen in the wealthy part of town? Be cleaned up in an hour and a half. It sat there for a decade. And of course, what happens when you leave a toxic dump in place? And when I say toxic, I don't use that word casual. All right, this was an old textile mill. So the floorboards reeked of chemicals, right, that were just spilled out. But it tells the story of the reclamation of that space and created a park that really is the prize of the city of Providence now. And then the people who worked so hard to reclaim the property nearby, which of course had fallen into complete disrepair. There were no homes on the streets nearby because no one would live next to this toxic waste dump. And they built, Community Development Corporation built hundreds of below market rate apartments. It tells the story of the complete reorganization of the Providence Police Department. The Providence Police Department used to be one of the most hidebound, paramilitary, brutal police departments in the country. Corrupt, badly corrupt. Some of you may know or know of the story of Buddy Cianci, the former mayor of Providence, notoriously corrupt. And he had completely corrupted the Providence Police Department. And I ran across in my research a study by the Department of Justice which collected brutality complaints from every major police department in the country. And the small city of Providence, in its peak, was only 180,000 people, had the third highest rate of brutality complaints for any police department in the country, after New Orleans and El Paso. Philadelphia, you'll want to know, did quite well in that study, which tells you how bad Providence was. They completely reimagined and reorganized the local elementary school. The local elementary school, William Debate Elementary School, was so bad that in the 90s and early thousands, the local principal wouldn't, the school principal wouldn't let the kids out for recess. Once they stepped inside, they had to stay inside. In the 90s, an armed guard patrolled the parking lot. When I first came to Olneyville, I was doing a tour with the director of this community development corporation, and we were driving by the school, and she said on her first day, she was getting a tour of Olneyville, and she passed this school, and she said, "Oh, what a shame that that school has been closed down, because the weeds were knee high, and there was a chain link fence around it at the front." And the person who was driving her around said, "No, it's not closed. That's the school." The principal once said to me, I asked him why it is the kids weren't allowed to go outside. And he explained it to me with a string of nouns that don't need a verb. He said, guns, drugs, glass, needles. When I was interviewing him, he was sitting behind his desk, and at one point, this is a guy who keeps mementos, he reached into the top drawer of his desk, and he pulled out a regular white envelope, and he slowly peeled off a rubber band that held the envelope shut, and he opened up the envelope, and he poured onto his desk 9 9mm spent shell casings, as well as 1 unspent casing, which he had collected from the playground one morning. Just making the rounds, he cleaned it up. One day he said there was gunfire outside, and so the school was in lockdown, and this is this imperturbable former Marine, and he called the downtown school board, and he said, "I just want to let you know, we're in lockdown, we're good, everything's fine, because we have bulletproof glass on the windows, but I thought I'd let you know." So, as a result of extraordinary work over a 15-year period, Olneyville now is a dramatically different place. Crime is down, the streets are better, businesses have returned, shops have opened, the streets are safe again, the alleys are lit. It's not perfect, but it's dramatically different. But of course, no good deed goes unpunished, right? And so in the last 12, 14 years, Olneyville has become considerably whiter, wealthier, better credentialed, more unequal, and substantially more expensive. In the last decade, rents have risen in Olneyville by 54%. So the writing is on the wall. And what this trajectory shows, what this trajectory captures, is the moral dilemma at the core of my book, the idea that I tried to capture with the title. Thanks for everything, now get out, which is the feeling people have in Olneyville. as they see the encroaching wave that's moving west from downtown, moving west from another neighborhood that has already been gentrified. And the moral dilemma at the core of my book is really simply this question. Is failure the inevitable cost of success? Can it be that in the wealthiest country in the world, the wealthiest country the world has ever known, that the poor, the working poor, only get to live in wretched neighborhoods? Is that our conclusion? Is our conclusion that they simply cannot enjoy safe streets? They are not entitled to good schools. They cannot have street corners that are free from knots of young men selling drugs. I'm sorry, you're not entitled to that. And when you do start to achieve the change, to make it into a safe, vibrant, exciting neighborhood, the sort of neighborhood that I imagine most of us live in, then they have to leave? Can that possibly be right? If that is right, then our society is wrong. So, in my book, there are no villains. It is too easy to point to someone and say, he is the problem, she is the problem. There are no villains. There are no villains, at least with blood and bones. There are no people who have set their mind to have this happen to Olneyville. In fact, the people who worked so hard to transform Olneyville did everything right. They did everything right. They used the tools available to them, the tools available in our day and age, to transform a neighborhood. And in fact, their transformation is a model of neighborhood revitalization, a model of neighborhood revitalization. And though they did everything right, still it is not enough. Still it is not enough. And the clock is ticking on Olneyville. And so what it tells me, and what I concluded, is that this is not a story about bad people. The people who are working in this area, the nonprofits, the community development corporations, the residents, they operate in an environment where, despite their best intentions, they suffer from the system in which they operate suffers from two fundamental problems. One of those problems is that in our society, in the current world we operate in, distressed neighborhoods like Olneyville cannot possibly remove enough property from the speculative market. They cannot decommodify enough property to forestall the wave of capitalism. That is, the appeal of selling to the highest bidder. And when that happens, you cannot keep up with the increase in the value of land, and neighborhoods become unaffordable. They cannot take enough property out of the speculative market. And the second thing, and the thing that took me longer to understand, because I was blinded by the good intentions of the organizations that were working there, I came to realize that the current model of neighborhood well-being empowers the wrong people. The current model for neighborhood well-being is built around a network of nonprofits and community development corporations that provide the services that used to be provided for by government. But in a government-bashing age, where government is imagined as the problem rather than the solution, government has retreated. For instance, the United States no longer builds public housing. Some of you may have thought they do. The United States hasn't built public housing since the 70s. In fact, we destroy public housing. Instead, we try to incentivize the private sector to build public housing. And the way we do that is through a partnership between the private sector and developers. And the oxygen that makes the current model work is private profit, which is managed and directed by a cluster of nonprofit and community development corporations, which exist in every single neighborhood. You can go to the most distressed neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and I guarantee you there is an alphabet soup of nonprofits that operate there, that compete for scarce funding. What the current model does is empower those organizations. It empowers those organizations. By and large, are exceedingly well-intended. But they are also, by and large, in fact, overwhelmingly, staffed, managed, and their board of directors are taken from folks who do not live in or come from these neighborhoods. They are not of these neighborhoods. There's a lot of reasons for that. One is that the pay is pretty bad, and folks can't afford the work. And those who can afford the work tend to be folks who have other sources of income. So it tends to be an elite, credentialed place, predominantly women, who can afford to do this work. It is not the neighborhood, and it is not neighborhood residents who are empowered. The political and social capital that accrues to the people who participate in these and are members of and employees of these organizations does not accrue to the residents. The residents end up being passive recipients of this process. They are supplicants rather than leaders. We do not empower the right people. You've probably heard Audre Lorde's expression, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. These are the tools that the organizations have at their disposal. And even when they wield them as effectively as they can possibly be wielded, it will not forestall the crush of privatization and the movement of capital into neighborhoods and gentrification and displacement that follows it. In my book, I propose an alternative, and I call that alternative a neighborhood trust. And the basic idea of a neighborhood trust is to transfer ownership and control of neighborhood assets, including all the money that flows into the neighborhood, to the neighborhood itself, to the low-income residents and their designated allies, instead of outsiders. Let the low-income residents of neighborhoods like Kensington control their own fate. Do not have other people control their fate for them. Let me tell you, folks in Kensington or Olneyville, folks who live there, who wake up every day and see the place and have lived there for years, they know what the problems are. They know, they don't need anybody to tell them what the problems are. They know what the problems are. Empower them. I'm very excited. My idea, I wrote it up in an article that was published before my book came out. And it was picked up by folks in Kensington, some of whom are here today. The Kensington Corridor Trust is the first neighborhood trust in the country. It's a very exciting experiment in the radical idea of shifting control of assets and wealth to low-income residents directly. Let them decommodify property, let them decide where assets are spent, empower them, vest them with the decision-making authority, let them chart their own fate. Whether these things will succeed, we don't know. It's too early to say. I am cautiously optimistic. There are models springing up that adopt the neighborhood trust idea and are taking it forward. But common to all of them is the idea of resident control and ownership of assets. But I will wind up with this observation and then hopefully get your questions. The central to my research, to all my work, Beth talked about other work I do, which is in the Guantanamo world and in the criminal justice world. Central to all of it is a moral claim. It is an abiding moral claim, which is that the poor have the same right to live in safe, viable, vibrant neighborhoods, that they have the same right to a healthy life as all of us. And if we cannot capture that, then we are the ones who are distressed. And if you share that vision, if you share that idea, I welcome you as an ally. Thank you very much. So what can I answer, sir?
I'm wondering if you have a model in mind or described in the book in which a hard-pressed neighborhood like Olneyville can attract more resources, more capital, without displacing the
Right. So, yeah. It is, so what the Kensington Community Trust is doing, or the Kensington Corridor Trust is doing, and what other models are doing, is they are leveraging philanthropic dollars, impact investment capital, which seeks a return, but a substantially lower return than simply market rate. What I would like to see is to leverage things like tax credits. I would like the federal government to get involved and to create tax credits where, like we currently, the low-income housing tax credit is the way in which we build below market rate housing in the United States now. And what it is that states get a certain allocation of tax credits, which are given to community development corporations that work in neighborhoods like Kensington and Olneyville or West Philly. And then they sell them to developers. And they use the money to fund their operations, and then the developers build low-income housing, below market rate housing, which guarantees them a stream of income. The government guarantees them a stream of income. You could use the same model to fund a neighborhood trust. You get a tax credit that can be sold. Investors get a stream of income, and the proceeds are used to fund a neighborhood trust, to allow them to decommodify capital and run the organizations that are currently run for them, and empower the residents to run their own lives. Nothing like that currently exists. And so in its place, you have models. There's another neighborhood trust model that's developing in Kansas City that tries to use philanthropic and impact investment funding to fund it as well. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you, ma'am.
This whole idea of empowering, right?
Right.
But how do you address the crime issue, which is what is really at the heart of this? How can decent people who want to provide for their families compete with drug lords and everything that you just mentioned? It seems to me that that's just something that sucks the vitality out of the neighborhood, and the people lose heart because they just figure, how are we ever going to control this?
Right. So, it's funny, my research began, and I discovered Olneyville because I have a background as a criminal justice student, and so I originally came to Olneyville to study the transformation of the police department. And that made me realize that the police department was really just one part of the transformation, so I had to widen the lens. But your question is exactly right. When a neighborhood is deeply, deeply challenged, distressed, the first thing that many residents will talk about is various types of crime and disorder. That does not mean, however, that there is only one way, that is with the iron fist, to respond to crime. The transformation that took place in Olneyville, in the Olneyville Police, or the Providence Police Department, and the transformation that has taken place in the best and most forward-thinking police departments is to shift away from the kind of tough-on-crime aggressiveness characterized by the warrior model of policing and saturation strategies like stop and frisk. Every major city in the country, including Philadelphia, in the 80s, 90s, and early aughts, had some variant of the New York stop and frisk program, which was deliberately overbroad, deliberately knowing that you were going to sweep in by the tens of thousands innocent people who were the folks that I started my talk with. They just get up every morning and want to go about their business, right? So there is a right way and a wrong way to go about crime control and policing in urban neighborhoods. And the wrong way is to be this very aggressive, impersonal force that generates so much mistrust. It is wrong to say that residents in a distressed neighborhood do not care about crime and disorder. They care deeply. Of course they do. And it's an insult to suggest they don't. But they also care about the way the police go about it. They don't like them being indiscriminate. And they don't like people being treated as though their dignity were a commodity that you could step on, right? There is a right way and a wrong way. And some departments, many of my students at Cornell describe themselves as abolitionists. That is, no cop is a good cop. I do not share that view because I've spent a lot of time with the police. I heard someone say he went to school at the University of Cincinnati. The Cincinnati Police Department actually is one that has undergone radical, dramatic changes from a time that it too was a bad force. It's a very different force now. And the key difference is to shrink the blue footprint so that the police do only that which they alone have the capacity to do. And the rest, they become partners with community allies. And you solve problems by changing conditions rather than just making a bunch of arrests, which will never solve a problem. So yes, crime matters, but it's wrong to think that you can only do it one way. Yes, ma'am, up in here.
I'm interested in talking about the job opportunities for the economy that are available to people in these neighborhoods. So really what we're saying is they don't have the resources to be able to get better housing. We need to have philanthropic entities come in and provide subsidies, right? What happens if the people were empowered with good jobs that enabled them to, be self-empowered as opposed to having it come from philanthropic dollars outside their world?
Yeah, so I love that. I agree with that. I think that one of the things I talk about in the book is what happens when we empower the working poor, when they are an organized political and economic force. As the trust grows, for instance, I think that people should be able to invest the proceeds of the neighborhood trust, and so that that they acquire the power that comes from wealth in this country, right? And so you have a trust that now commands tens of millions of dollars. Well, suddenly then they can command that businesses that deal with the trust must pay a living wage. Businesses that deal with, that are in the neighborhood must not be extractive. They must provide benefits, right? If you want to work here, if you want to have the benefit of renting from the unit that we own, you're going to have to. It's going to have to be a better job, right? And we can command that because we now have the economic resources. That's what it means to empower folks, right? So they become, in addition to an economic force, they become a political force, right? This takes time, but that is the aspiration. Did you want to follow up, or? Yep.
Because what you initially started with is the textile industry was there, and then the textile industry left, nobody has a job, and then it deteriorates. So why, I keep coming back to the fundamental, these are fundamentally economic issues. There's not enough quality employment jobs and opportunities for them to control their fate economically or otherwise.
Yeah. This is a longer conversation. I think that you can change that too, but yes, ma'am.
Mine's kind of, it tags on to the concept. I'm struggling a little bit with the idea of leveraging philanthropic dollars, but that's already, you have that already. You're leveraging NGOs, you're philanthropy now in these campus. So are you not just substituting in the end the people that are donating money to your trust? They're going to leverage, when you leverage their dollars, you're also going to end up leveraging their opinions and their input. So I'm struggling with how a community trust set up on philanthropic dollars is going to be any more significant different than what we have.
Well, so I think there's a couple things. One, I think that it's the philanthropic and the impact investment dollars are a short term, and I would rather see the kind of no strings attached sale of tax credits. I think that would be right, and a condition of it is that we will sell you these tax credits and fund the trust with it, but only on the condition that you don't get to tell us how to operate the trust, right? But we don't live in that world yet. One of the features of, first, that's one thing. Secondly, the organizations that are funded now, yes, the foundations exercise influence, but the people who are empowered are the employees and management of those organizations, right? They get the social and political capital that comes from being part of those organizations. Well, I think all those organizations should be run by, managed and staffed by folks in the neighborhood to the maximum extent that you can, right? So let the political capital accrue to folks in the neighborhood. Your point's well taken. I don't want to.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's absolutely what needs to happen, but I think it's contrary to all human instinct that when someone is given a lot of money, whether they're a philanthropic or an investor, it goes counter to human nature. That's nice, but
I agree.
I hope you're right. I hope it works. That's all I'm gonna say.
And look, I see you, ma'am. Let me come to you 1 second. The dream, the ideal of it's mostly to African American self-control, not self-control, control of their own wealth, dates back to before Marcus Garvey, right? So it is an old dream, and I recognize it's never happened in this country. It's never been allowed to happen in this country. But if there were something radical that could happen, I would want to see the empowerment of the poor rather than the service to the poor by, you get it. I don't have to finish that paragraph.
I agree with that. That's not what I'm struggling with. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
So I was thinking about, as you're talking about like putting the power back into the residents, the outsiders, I'm really thinking about like this reality of that as like the way that I see neighborhoods gentrifying and doing now. It's like slowly happening over time, and so you have people that have come in recently that do feel, and maybe if they've only been there 2 years, 5 years, but they do feel like ownership over this neighborhood at this point, and they're getting involved, and you have these like folks who have been there for a really long time, kind of colliding with people that are new but feel ownership over this neighborhood. And so I'm just curious, like how that plays out. How
Yeah.
you've seen that play out.
So that's great. So when I talked about this idea with folks, people say, Joe, you describe the neighborhood as though it's a living thing. And I do think it's a living thing. But the neighborhood doesn't vote. People vote, right? So who decides for the neighborhood, right? I think that's a really serious question, right? Do you make the decision based on income levels, right? They get to decide the course of the neighborhood trust. And wealthier folks who come in there and who are part of a gentrifying wave, we're just going to exclude them. Or do you do it just based on residence? Or do you have some residency condition, like it's only people who have lived there for more than 18 months or 2 years or something like that? I think those are thorny questions that I don't have good answers for, but I think that those questions have to be resolved democratically. Is that responsive or?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't have, sorry.
No, please, go ahead. Your hand was up first.
I don't have a question, so I want you to comment. I've lived in the Italian market for 25 years. And just recently, around the corner from me on Christian Street, somebody built a condo and they went on the market 1.2 million each. That is the most ridiculous, absurd, stupid thing you can imagine.
But it's not. If it can fetch that price, suddenly it's not
Oh,
ridiculous.
no, they're all occupied.
Oh, sir.
And what was interesting is I was there when the gentrification wave started. So right around the corner by the Rite Aid was this whole block of townhomes that were built with the big bay windows. And they were completed and people moved in. And we were walking along the street going to the Rite Aid. And the bay windows were collapsing. And this is going on all over that particular neighborhood. And I'm at a loss. I mean, there are a number of us that are really horrified by what's going on. You know, it's just a comment. The fact that on Christian and 10th Street, there's a $1.2 million condo. It's such an absurd.
Yeah. And of course, that story, that very story, where people saying, you know, my folks bought this little 3-flat for $46,000 in 1968. I grew up there. Now each unit, not the whole building, each unit sells for $1 million, right? I mean, that's a story that came from my book.
Well, the house next door to me just sold for $680,000. And it's just, we're just a little street of row houses,
Right.
2-story row houses.
This is what I mean about decommodifying property.
So you're inspiring me.
Well, I'm awfully glad to hear that.
To
You're the
see-
only
to
person
see
I've
if we can
inspired.
do something about that.
Trust me, you're the only person I've inspired this month. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Joe.
Hi.
If I may, likewise, if I may just respond
Yeah.
super quickly, just to go on.
But introduce yourself and tell.
Apologies. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Athenaeum. I'm the executive director of the Kensington Corridor Trust, that Joe mentioned. I'll start there and then go there. So in terms of thinking about kind of the asset structure and the asset types that are selling in the neighborhood, you know, although we see it as an indication of gentrification, it's important to acknowledge that what we see happening today actually started 5 to 10 years ago.
Oh,
So
yes.
we're looking at like Kensington, places like that. As property values are rising, we can really look back historically and see that trend. That may not have been as visible in that moment, but it becomes visible with the things in the market. You're like, oh,
Well, when
wow.
I saw 25 years ago, when I saw the windows collapse, you know, I thought, okay, this is where we're going.
Absolutely. And the second thing was around who's making the decisions in the model. So for KCP, our organization democratically has decided that only this was your point. Only what we consider legacy residents are able to partake in the what we call the power table or our governing body. Initially, that was defined as folks who lived or had businesses in the neighborhood for more than 5 years. That's actually being revisited now to potentially extend it to 10 years back. And I will say most of, if not all, of our governing body right now is made up of folks who have been there for more than.
And you can imagine, I don't want to cut you off, but you can imagine a different neighborhood would come to a different resolution of that. The whole point is, let them decide for themselves.
And then just around philanthropy. So, yes, I totally hear what you're saying around philanthropy, just continuing to fund in a different way. For the KCT, because we are so committed to that neighborhood power and that local control, we are prepared at any time to turn down funding that comes with strings attached. And we have already done so. So we're very, very clear about where the power lies and what we will and will not accept as contingencies on dollars that are provided either as investment or as such.
So you can tell why I'm so excited about the Kensington Corridor Trust, partly because Adriana is so good, and partly because they're just taking my idea and running with it, and it's much better now, right? I mean, I'm the first to say, this is what I think, and then other people have made it vastly better, which to me is pretty cool. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Can I just ask Adriana one quick question? Because you do know how this is structured. How do they get people like you on their board? And how have you been received by a neighbor?
Absolutely.
Great question.
Yeah, great question. So in terms of the governing body, currently we are what I would consider traditional governance structure, and then folks identify each other, and then we have further conversations around, do you need a certain skill set? Where do you lie in terms of our representation of the neighborhood, et cetera? We are actually right now considering moving towards what we consider participatory democracy style governance in 2022, which is where the broader neighborhood elects the folks at the power table. So instead of just like, hey, I know you, I'm on this board, would you like to be on this board? It's, hey, neighborhood, here are the folks who are up for slate and candidacy that have said they're expressing some interest in joining. Does the neighborhood want this individual representing them? And so right now we're in the process of trying to fundraise to bring on a consultant to help us explore those types of governance, which do exist across the nation. There are not tons of them, but there are other models that have been very successful in being implemented. So that's how we do that. And then what was the other part of the question?
That's how are the neighbors? How have you?
Yes. So the KCTR structure, we are deeply committed to not creating new systems, and so we go where folks are. So Kensington is actually one of the most, just the best organized urban center that I personally worked in, and I've worked in various at this point. There are tons of neighborhood and civic associations that are led and driven by residents and small business owners that we tap into. So my colleague here, Jennifer Acosta, is our organizer. And so she's going and meeting folks where they are versus us trying to create, a new meeting that people need to come to or a new group. We're not doing any of that. So wherever we can be that folks are, that's where we want to go, and that's where we want to meet folks.
Excellent, I can see why you're successful.
Oh, we're trying.
Ma'am, did you have a question here? Did you have a question here, ma'am?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you now that I know that you're involved.
I'm so sorry.
When you first started, how did education play into this? Because it's not just something, I know myself, I'm not real savvy with money, and, if somebody gave me, if I was on your board and somebody gave me an offload of money and said, here, you need to use this in a constructive manner to revitalize the community, I have to go to somebody to learn. How do I do this, and how do I do this, and where do I get shares from, and so forth and so on, so.
Absolutely. Yeah, so tons of education. The first part of it, kind of the birth of the model after reading Joe's article in SSIR from the Social Transformation Review Journal was around the model itself. What is a neighborhood trust? How do we want to build it? What's the legal framework that goes behind it? How do we fund it? When does it become sustainable? How is it governed? So there's tons of education around that. Then the next step was, are we all prepared to invest these dollars into this neighborhood? So do we understand real estate? Do we understand real estate finance? Do we understand property management, et cetera? Our current education now is happening around governance specifically. How do we govern? How do we elect those that are at the power table? And that's where we've been moving slowly towards participatory democracy. But I will say all of our education has been funded by philanthropists, folks who want to build our capacity to build a model, acknowledging that it can be scaled and replicated over time. I see our next iteration of education around the community investment trust model.
Yeah.
So Joe mentioned the ability for residents to directly invest and be a part of the upside. We want that to be a part of the neighborhood trust structure. It requires tons of education, both in terms of understanding financial background, but also understanding what the impact of those dollars are, how to reinvest your yield, right? Like you have X dividend a year, how do you reinvest that dividend versus kind of just cashing out? All of that requires tons of education. We see ourselves several years away from that. Currently, our goal right now is to acquire densely and quickly because private capital and shared capital is already there. Kensington is the next neighborhood on the cusp of gentrification, so we don't have time to sit and do that education right now. We need to get moving and make sure these assets get modified, and then we'll turn to the education of that piece and get folks to directly invest.
Let me also respond to your question. When I first presented my idea about the neighborhood trust to folks in Olneyville, to these groups that do so much work there, honest to goodness, one woman said to me, "Great idea, but they're just not ready." Right? Now these are well-intended folks. They have the best of intention. But think about what they've just said, right? When are they going to be ready, right? They're never going to be ready unless you invest in getting them ready. Furthermore, look, I'm sure that you and I could sit down and we could work together and you could become ready. You're not ready now, but nobody has the skills needed to do all the parts of a job when they start the job. That's what training is for.
Adriana is, she is very, very educated and has tons of experience in a lot of organizations and boards. So she's.
Yes, of course. Right. That's right. But you may not have an entire staff of. But that's not the point. Look, to me, that's not the point anyway. I mean, the residents get the problems. The rest is just technocracy. You can teach them what they need to know, but you can't provide the kind of deep knowledge that comes from being of and part of that neighborhood. That's just irreplaceable. Yes, ma'am.
So, two questions. One, suppose that you think your neighborhood needs help with police, with school buildings, with water. It seems to me like we're just talking about properties here, in terms of the funding. How do you cross those administrative boundaries in the city?
Well, what do you mean?
Second question.
Oh, yeah, sure.
What kind of money are we talking about? What do you need to revitalize a neighborhood?
Well, so first of all, whatever the amount of money is, it's the same if it's managed by outsiders as if it's managed by insiders. So you're not talking about different money, you're talking about different control of the money, right? In more direct answer to your question, it is a...
Because you yourself had said you want to give tax credits to these neighbors. Well, how much money in tax credits?
Oh, I think it'd be millions of dollars for many of these neighborhoods, millions of dollars.
So have you done mathematical models?
No,
Okay.
no.
Just
No, that's fair. Is this an expensive program? Yeah. You know, but let me just sort of respond to that.
I'm not arguing.
No, I know
it's
you're
gonna
not.
be expensive, okay? I'm just saying.
Yes, it's going to be expensive.
What are the parameters?
That's right. It's going to be expensive.
Okay.
I'm completely nonplussed by that. Yes, it's going to be expensive. And nobody whipped out their calculators and figured out the cost to Olneyville when they let this toxic dump sit there for a decade. Nobody's.
It's not justified. You're fine.
Yeah. And I don't mean to bark at you, but let's just
No, I'm working back. Don't worry.
bark at each other. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a question. Could you give an example of what you are talking about when you talk about decommodification?
Oh, sure. So in Olneyville, the apartments and single-family homes many of them that were built, split the ownership structure so that let me use my own example. When I buy my home, I own the structure and the land. Okay. These are built on what's called a shared equity arrangement, so that the purchaser only buys the house. They don't buy the land underneath it. The land underneath it is owned by the trust, and it is held by the trust for the benefit of the whole neighborhood. And the value that accrues to neighborhoods that are increasing in value is in the land. So the structure itself doesn't increase in value that much. So when that person sells, if that person chooses to sell, they're not selling the whole bundle of rights. So you are decommodifying it in the sense that a new purchaser doesn't buy the whole bundle. They don't get the same benefit. They don't get the same growth out of it. Moreover, in exchange for when you purchased it, or let's say it's a shared equity arrangement, when the purchaser buys it, because they're only buying a fraction of the bundle of rights, they get it at a lower rate. And so I can specify it has to be purchased by someone who is low income. And when you sell it, it has to be sold to someone who is low income, right? Now that's a classic shared equity. The value of the land that increases is owned by the neighborhood as a whole, the whole trust. and the owner owns just a smaller bundle. So that's a classic decommodification scheme, if you will.
Can the community use any of that money that
Sure.
value that
It's wealth. It's absolutely, it's wealth. They can leverage that. They can get debt from that. They can absolutely. It's just like a private corporation that owns the building. The land is valuable. They can take out loans based on that. They can do everything that anybody else does, except for as a trust, it is held for the benefit of the residents. What they can't do is sell the land to the highest bidder, right? Because the residents. That's how you maintain affordability in a neighborhood.
So this is a 21st century version of ground rent. That the ground rent is not owned by a private individual.
That's right. It's a 21st century version of the community land trust, which has been around for 100 years. But it's larger than the community land trust. It can be built to scale in a way that most community land trusts aren't. Yes? Yes, ma'am. So what, Adriana can talk about what they're doing up in Kensington, but what you do is, so the greatest model of this, one of the greatest successes of this took place in the Dorchester, Roxbury neighborhood of Boston, which some of you may be familiar with, which was a badly distressed neighborhood. There were, it's a larger area than Olneyville, but there were literally thousands of vacant properties. There was a community land trust that was created in Dorchester and Roxbury, and the way it acquired land is the city of Boston, by eminent domain, gave the land to a trust that was created, right? Dorchester Roxbury Community Land Trust. And they built on it pursuant to these shared equity arrangements, so that people who buy there or who rent apartments, they don't own the land. The land is owned by the residents of Dorchester and Roxbury. And the value, the increases in the value of land have been dramatic. Why? Because, well, in just the way we all know, because Boston is a completely different city than it was 70s and 80s. Right? All that value in land, all that accrual has gone to the benefit of neighborhood residents in the trust rather than to private landowners.
Yeah, I just had a question about how this all intersects with zoning boards and government. You might have something you want to vision, but the zoning board is developers, Philadelphia, for example, and they undo what you're trying to
No, I mean, if you want to answer, I mean, the short answer to your question is no. I mean, if you create a legally binding trust, it's protected by law. That's the whole point of it. But if you want to talk about the local experience here.
Yeah, so what I'll say is that for the KCT experience specifically, we are only focused on Kensington Avenue, which is a commercial thoroughfare corridor. Almost every single property on the avenue is zone CMX2. So by right, it actually already meets our strategic purpose, which is to repopulate the commercial corridor with commercial businesses. If this model, like trust neighborhoods, is taken out into the residential aspect, I could foresee some of those challenges depending on where they're trying to acquire. But for KCT, it's not a challenge because the corridors are already zoned for our needs.
But there's no legal obstacle to that's the virtue of the neighborhood trust, is that it builds on existing legal models. So you don't have to break new legal ground. And it would be protected by zoning laws. I think we're out of time.
I gotta say, this is pretty amazing for a small group, but I was counting, half of the people here have asked a question. So this is really fantastic. I think when we do our annual report next year and we do our little index, this is gonna be probably the program where the most people ask questions. So thank you, Joe, and thank you, Adriana, also, for joining us. With the interest that's here, I think I want to, talk to you at some point later and invite you to come and speak, the staff of the trust. Wonderful. I think just let you know, coming up Next week, our movie matinees, a little bit of fun with Carrie Rickey, movie critic. Next Monday at 2, a couple of short early Buster Keaton films. And we're talking with her. She's going to take us through this fall, the 20s, the 30s, and then the 40s in the movie. So that should be a lot of fun. And next Thursday, September 30th at 6 p.m., we welcome historian Brian Masaru Hayashi, who looks at Asian American spies, and in his talk, as part of his new book, but looking at Asian American spies who participated with the Korean independence movement from 1941 to 1945. But before that, Sunday is going to be glorious weather in Washington Square from 3 to 5. We are hosting, probably will be the first concert maybe ever in Washington Square with the Independence National Historical Park. We are going to have 2 hours of glorious music, violins and keyboards, marimbas and drums, the Commonwealth Youth Choirs, and Mother Bethel AME's trio also closing us out. So I hope you will join us as we celebrate the history of Washington Square as a gathering place for African Americans during the colonial era, as a burial space for African Americans and the poor and strangers to the city, and the victims of the yellow fever epidemic, which rings so true for what we have been going through in the past 2 years as we lift up our history and look at where we are today as a community standing together. So bring your picnic blanket and a picnic, or your picnic chairs, your beach chairs, or whatever you want. Find a great place to sit. 3 to 5 on Sunday is going to be beautiful weather, and we hope you all come free and open to the public. Bring your friends, bring your family, bring your neighbors. We look forward to seeing you at that and other future events. You are all welcome, and we're glad that you're here. Thank you to Joe for coming down from Cornell and a fantastic conversation. Richard is in the back. Pre-order the book. He'll make sure it gets to you. Joe will sign book plates back there also, and I'm sure you can bend his ear a bit more. This has been a wonderful conversation and a wonderful evening. Thank you for coming out.